Speaking of indispensable, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that without Jared Taylor, we would not have the movement that we have today, and that most people in this room would not be aware of these issues and able to articulate them as we do today without American Renaissance and Jared's writing for close to 2 decades. Jared holds a degree from Yale University and the Institut d'études politiques de Paris. He is the president of the New Century Foundation and, of course, the editor of its monthly publication, American Renaissance. His books include Paved with Good Intentions, and his latest, White Identity, is White Identity, Racial Consciousness in the 21st Century. And, you know, I mentioned this at the press club, but I think I'll mention it again because it's something that always comes to mind when I think of Jared, is that, you know, a mutual colleague joked that Jared has the demeanor and ability to be a U.S. senator. I said, don't take that as an insult. But instead, he decided to become a religious heretic, and he decided to stand against the odds for his people. And I hope everyone appreciates how remarkable that is when someone of that amount of talent who could have used that in other directions instead takes a stand for what he believes and in a movement that is heretical and is often can often not lead to having an easy life. But he has done that, and he has done it for decades, and that is a great inspiration. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Jared Taylor.
Well, Richard is far too generous, of course. I'm frankly a Johnny-come-lately to many of these ideas, as I will point out when I introduce someone who came to them far sooner and more thoroughly than I, Sam Dixon, later on. But thank you for that overly kind introduction. I've been asked by Richard to speak about how we get from here to there. And the fact of the matter is, I've never done anything practical in my life. I've been a scribbler and an occasional speaker, but I've never built a movement. I've never put together a political party. I've never done any of those things. So I feel rather at a disadvantage here. But I shall do my best. It seems to me that we're all here because we're white, and we want to live in a society that reflects our values. We want to live in a white majority society. Clearly, there are daunting obstacles for that to happen. So how do we make that happen? It would really be a remarkable achievement for that to happen in our lifetimes, but how do we make it happen? It seems to me there are really sort of 3 strands of thinking about how this would come about. And I would call them the archaeofuturist strand. I would call it perhaps the Danish model, and then the Orania model. Now, the archaeofuturist strand is taken from the book Archaeofuturism, published by Arctos. By the way, I salute Arctos. I've read 3 of the books that Mr. Morgan mentioned, all fine works. And Archaeofuturism by Guillaume Fay. His view is that only from catastrophe will white consciousness and racial identity emerge. What I call the Danish model is a more conventionally political approach. And some of the smaller countries in Europe, I think, show very encouraging signs. In Denmark, in Austria, for example, you have people who are in political positions, elected leaders, who think exactly as we do. They don't necessarily speak as we do, but they think as we do. And then the Orania model, that would be a kind of ingathering, a community forming of racially conscious whites, as is the case in this Boer Afrikaner group in Orania in South Africa, where they have decided that they are going to basically build a community from scratch, for their people and for their descendants, hopefully forever. So I think these are sort of the 3 approaches we can take here. And they're not mutually exclusive. There's no reason why those who believe that out of crisis will grow racial consciousness not to support these other two kinds of things. And at the same time, of course, to do the educational kind of work that I have tried to do, that National Policy Institute tries to do. So let me take all three of these in turn. This, the catastrophe theory. I'll tell you right from the start that perhaps it's my personality, but I'm not attracted to the worse is better theory. I think worse is often just plain worse. And somehow the notion that out of the rubble is going to spring forth this fully grown racial solidarity, and that whites are going, my brother white, you know. I think when there's blood in the streets and the power's cut off, I'm not convinced that whites aren't going to be shooting each other as much as they're shooting anybody else. But how can we judge the extent to which crisis really does develop racial consciousness? I've scratched my head over this question, and I've tried to look into it to the extent that one can look into it seriously. And for example, take the American Depression, the Great Depression. Unemployment was at 25%. A whole lot of people were suddenly impoverished. This was a real crisis. It marked my parents' generation. To what extent did that experience raise racial consciousness in the United States? It's not an easy question to answer. But one thing that I've done is I've looked into the statistics on the lynchings of blacks, for example. And if you look through the worst Depression years, you'll find that during this gradual downtrend in numbers, the Great Depression had no effect, no discernible effect on the lynching of blacks. You might expect that a racially rekindled and reawakened white society might have lynched more blacks. I don't know if this is a fair index, but that is what you will find. Likewise, if you look at the differentials in unemployment for blacks and whites for that period, blacks were unemployed at higher rates than whites, but again, if racial solidarity blossoms from the ruins, you would think that they would suddenly be thrown out of work at greater rates. Again, there's a kind of parallelism in unemployment, that blacks didn't suffer in any kind of particular way from greater unemployment. So now there are probably many other aspects of the Depression that I can't claim to have done an exhaustive study of how this affected the racial thinking of whites. But at least by those two indices that I looked into, there's not much to go on. At the same time, some of you, of course, remember the Argentine crisis of 1999 to 2001. It was a serious situation. They had 25% unemployment. They defaulted on their sovereign debt. There was rioting. There were deaths. And in 2001, the president of Argentina, Fernando de la Rúa, he declared a state of emergency. He got on a helicopter and did a bunk. He just left the presidential palace. You're talking about a serious crisis for a country. Now, again, I cannot claim to be exhaustively knowledgeable about what the social circumstances were like as a result of that. But I see no evidence that there was more persecution of the small number of non-whites who live in Argentina. I just see no evidence that this resulted in the kind of awakening that some people predict for the United States. Then finally, just a final example here is the current Greek crisis. We've got this debt crisis. Last summer, again, there was rioting. People are getting shot down. Their sovereign debt is downrated to junk. The Greek parliament is cutting the public sector and hiving people off jobs. And traditionally in Greece, there has been a national movement that occasionally takes it out on the Turks and the Albanians and the Gypsies and the Africans. I see no evidence that those groups are mixing it up with those minorities any more than before. And even more important, I see no evidence that there is a broader acceptance of that kind of thing than there was before the crisis. And then finally, of course, we are living in what's considered the worst economic disaster since the Great Depression. And again, I don't see anything that is easily pointed out as a kind of sign of nascent racial consciousness that can be attributed to that. At the same time, I think those who insist that only from catastrophe will our salvation come, I'm not convinced necessarily there will be the kind of blood in the streets, the power gets turned off kind of catastrophe. I'm not sure. Furthermore, If that is what you think really is necessary, then presumably you should be in favor of more and more Somali Bantu immigrants who don't know how to use a light switch. You should be in favor of the power grid going out. You should hope for infectious diseases and epidemics. I can't bring myself to hope for those things. Maybe I'm just a sentimentalist, but it's difficult for me to hope that these things are going to happen. So I think that instead of expecting this kind of deus ex machina, we have to think in terms of the practical hard slog of what we can do. And I think the things that we can do legitimately and practically will, of course, prepare the ground should there be a catastrophe of the kind that I'm describing, and would mean that this catastrophe would result in this kind of flowering that people may hope for. So, as far as conventional political activity is concerned, the Danish model that I'm talking about, I believe that if you start modestly and small, there are many jurisdictions in this country that are ripe for an attractive pro-white candidate. I've been on many, many, many radio and television programs over the years, call-in programs. And back when I was first talking about these things, first talking about them in the sort of most gentle and indirect kind of way with some of my earlier books, I would be deluged with angry callers. Well, now if I'm on the radio, even conservative hosts are astonished at how much support I get, at the number of callers who will call up and say, I agree with everything Mr. Taylor has said. And I'm talking about explicitly racialist arguments. I think there's a real change of climate out there in the real America, a change of climate that you see in the comments that people leave on major news websites if there's a story that has anything to do with race. Many of those commenters look as though they were sitting in this very room, extremely explicit expressions of an understanding, a perfect understanding of what's going on. I think also, if you look at some of the people who have run for office on a pro-white program, David Duke, back in 1989, he was elected to the State House, despite the fact that there was overwhelming opposition to him. Every newspaper, every political party, there was this monolithic opposition to him. And after that, when he left the State House and ran for state-level office, again, there could not have been a more hysterical and united opposition against him, and yet he won a majority of the white vote. Now, some people said, well, this is because he's had that armband and hood past, and so people know he's the real thing. I don't think that was it. I think that there was support for him despite that. I don't think white people, even in Louisiana, are particularly impressed with armbands and hoods. I think what they were looking for was the very message David Duke was at that time conveying, which is a moderate, sensible, pro-white, anti-immigration, and anti-affirmative action platform. Another good example is Frank Borzilleri. This is in the Bronx, in New York City, in what he used to describe as the belly of the beast. He was elected to the school board in 1993, served for 11 years until 2004. And during that period, he spoke at 4 American Renaissance conferences. He could not have been more out of the closet. And he talked about the coming dark ages when blacks and Hispanics were going to become the majority. He spoke frankly about IQ differences. And he was elected the most popular member of the school board twice. He was returned to office with increasing majorities time after time. The only way he was finally diddled out of his job was when there was a complete reorganization of New York City school boards, and all of the local school boards were consolidated into one big one, and he then no longer had a constituency that could send him into office. He is also an example of what Alex Kurtagic was talking about. Enjoy what you're doing. I've never seen a happier warrior than Frank Borzilleri. He was always happy to mix it up. I remember him telling me about a radio program he'd been on with Michael Levin, who was a brilliant scholar of racial differences in IQ. And it turns out outside the studio, there was a bunch of black thugs who were sort of lurking and waiting. And Michael Levin wants to, let's go out the other door. Not Frank. Hey, let's meet these guys. Well, Frank was a weightlifter, and he was ready for anything and enjoyed mixing it up. I think that was a lot of his charm, was how much he clearly enjoyed carrying the fight to the enemy. And so I salute Alex for pointing that out. I think that's extremely important. There are some other politicians that we don't necessarily hear that much about. In 2008, in Bastrop County, Texas, a fellow named Tim Kleinschmidt ran for the State House, and he was reelected in 2010. And one of the things that got him back into office was a big posters all over the place that said just 3 words on them: deport illegal immigrants. This was the slogan that got him back into the State House. And this is a county that is 40% Hispanic. So there is resonance to this kind of appeal. Another example is a fellow named Lauren Nichols. Now, I'm not sure he's necessarily the best model, but he is running for the City Council of Kennewick, Washington. And he has already made it through the primaries and will go on to the November 8th general election. And the centerpiece of his campaign is a program whereby the city of Kennewick is going to give illegal immigrants 30 days to get out of town, and if they're not out of town, they get the death penalty. Now, as I say, I think there may be more effective approaches, but this got him 26% of the vote, and it got him through the general election. So there are possibilities out there. And in fact, I was very, very optimistic when David Duke was elected to the State House in Louisiana, because, as I say, he had an extremely moderate and reasonable program, and I thought, gosh, there are going to be people that do not have his past that are going to copy his political program word for word and get elected to the State House or the city government all around the country. It didn't happen. I'm not sure why. We just didn't see those candidates. Again, he's an example of the kind of packaging that can be very effective. I remember one friend of mine telling me that he had never been able to persuade his girlfriend of any of the arguments on our side. But as soon as she saw David Duke on television, she says, "Wow, he's great. He's so good looking. I'll vote for him." This sort of thing works. Like it or not, that sort of thing works. So again, I think if we are practical, I think if we start modestly, there are elected offices for which we can run. And even if a campaign is not successful, if it attracts any kind of publicity at all, this is, again, a great educational opportunity for our people. And to the extent that they succeed, they can build on themselves. Now, this third, the Urania prong of this trident of mine, white communities. Now, there's so much talk about things that are implicitly white. Well, I'm tired of things that are implicitly white. You go to a performance of the opera, you can say, okay, that's implicitly white. Well, it doesn't do us any good. I want things that are explicitly white. Without groups, action that is explicitly white, we're going nowhere. I remember once years ago at an American Renaissance conference, a fellow who was a veteran of many of them walked up to me and he said, "It's great to be among the living again." When I think to myself, wouldn't it be great to live among the living, have communities where we are the community, where the community, even if it's a small community, it would be like being in this room, but that is where you would live. That's where you would make your life. We have in our country, of course, many precedents of people establishing communities. Most of them are based on religion, the Amish, the Shakers, but that's something that's happened over and over again. We have some just absolutely cuckoo examples. You all remember the People's Temple, where you have this absolute psychopath, Jim Jones, who managed to persuade 900 people to go all the way to Guyana, for heaven's sake, to build a community. If that kook can do something like that, surely sane white people can build communities where we can live among the living for a change. There is, I think, a lesson to be learned from what the Orthodox Jews have done. There are 3 cities in New York State, that are now essentially Orthodox communities: New Square, Monroe, and Monsey. New Square and Monroe were both sort of greenfield establishments. That is to say, in one case, a rabbi bought a big farm and he divided it up into lots, and his congregation moved there. But now these are places of populations of 10,000 and 20,000. These are substantial communities. Monsey developed a little bit differently, and it would be more of a kind of a model that would make sense for us. It was a conventional Gentile town, but it had a Orthodox divinity school, and then a yeshiva was built there. And more of the graduates stayed, and pretty soon more and more of the institutions in this town reflected the kind of place where Orthodox like to live. And now, slowly, gradually, it has become a completely Orthodox town. It's a place, of course, where you can't buy a house unless you're Orthodox. That's against the law, but then nobody who is not Orthodox wants to live there. And I suppose it must have been a little unpleasant, or quite maybe very unpleasant, for the Gentiles who sold out. But at least when they sold out at a hefty premium because the Orthodox wanted to move in, unlike so many whites who have had to sell out at a terrible loss because blacks and Hispanics wanted to move in. But the result is, in these communities, you have completely stable Orthodox congregations and establishments. The mayor is Orthodox. If you call a plumber, he's Orthodox. Like the carpenter is Orthodox. These communities have no police force because there's no crime. So this is something that creates an environment for children. And the Orthodox have discovered long ago that they are such dissenters, they are so out of step from modernity that they have to have communities in order to keep their children in that faith. Now, I'm a father. I'm particularly conscious of how difficult it is for children growing up in this poisonous environment. Television is poison. The movies are poison. The culture is poison. The schools are poison. You have to battle this all the time. People say that, well, of course, the solution is homeschooling. Well, not every child and not every parent is temperamentally suited to homeschooling. There are reasons for schools. It's a more efficient way to transmit knowledge so long as there's certain cultural consensus about that. But this is the kind of thing you fight. I remember one of my daughters, she had a 4th grade project, and she was supposed to read a biography and then write a report on this biography. And since we live in Virginia, one of the possible persons whose biography that she could read was Robert E. Lee. Well, I gently encouraged Robert. You can't be too forceful about these things, so they'll push back. I gently encouraged Robert E. Lee. Well, she came back from school a few days later, and she says, Daddy, I've decided who I'm going to write my biography about. And I said, well, who's that? She says, Rosa Parks. Well, this is the kind of thing that happens. Now, this has a silver lining in that she reported to me, my 4th grade daughter, that it was the most boring thing she'd ever read in her life, the story of this Rosa Parks lady. But then when this same daughter went to middle school, some of her classmates discovered what has been written about me on the internet. Well, this circulated around the class like it was pictures of naked ladies. This was really sort of the pornography of the 7th grade. And some of the parents of my daughter's friends forbade their children to come visit my daughter at her house for fear of the kind of poisons that she might imbibe if some of them were to step across the threshold. Now, fortunately, my daughter is pretty thick-skinned, but children, for the most part, are conformists. They want to please their classmates. They want to please their teachers, sometimes more than they want to please their parents. And I suppose I'm an inveterate victim of fantasy, but I would like to fantasize about middle school in which my daughter's classmates read about me, what's written on the internet, and they say, gee, you got a pretty cool dad. But that, of course, children never think their parents are cool. Now, this idea of having a community is particularly important for children. The people in this room, we are hardened veterans at reading the news with an eye to the lies that are being told, the omissions, the slant. We can read it and we know what's important, we know what's not. Children can't do this. They absorb what's around them. And try as you might, they are going to absorb things that you don't want. And you don't want constantly to be pushing them in some direction that is not comforting and conforming. It's a real struggle. So I think a community of this kind in which a small number of activists could arrive in some small white community and get themselves voted to the city council, get themselves voted to the school board. I don't think it would take a huge number, a small activist minority, especially if it were a place where the population already was more or less sympathetic to us. I think certain achievements could be made. Now, some people will tell you, no, it wouldn't work. You know, they'd slam you with all sorts of laws. I don't think that's the case. There is no law in the United States that requires integration. There are laws that forbid discrimination. And once this community got some sort of reputation as being one that welcomes whites, with a school board has a pro-white sort of attitude, the non-whites wouldn't really want to come. Very few people want to be test cases. They don't really want to buck the system. They don't want to be where they're not welcome. And of course, they would think that they'd be surrounded by gun-toting crazy white people who would make life impossible for them. So I don't think that'd be a problem. If there were a white community of this kind, I think the problem would be the other way around, keeping out the kooks and the weirdos and the crazies, the ones who would say, you expect me to make a living? Hey, I'm a white Aryan warrior, man. I don't have to. This is the kind of people that I think, you know, there are some of them who would have to be kept out. Now, clearly, the whole idea of uprooting you and your household to move to someplace, it's a very difficult one. And whenever a subject like this comes up, everyone, wherever he lives, always has a dozen reasons to explain why just as a strange coincidence, the very place where he lives is perfect for an experiment of this kind. But it is this difficult thing of moving, and I hope that that would not be a permanent obstacle for our doing something of this kind. I think it would have to be, again, a small place, probably in the South, where the population already has something of a racial consciousness. If you went to the Northwest, some of these places that should seem perfect for an experiment of this kind, those people who all they know about non-whites is what they read in the newspapers, they are completely deluded. They'd run you out of town on a rail, some of them. But if you started like this, pretty soon I think you might be able to send representatives to the State House. You could gradually expand. Hopefully, we live in a big country. There are imitators. These things could happen all over the country. Some of you will complain, this is much too small. This is just terribly unambitious. I want to take our country back. Well, believe me, I want to take our country back just as much as any of you. But that is, for now, I'm afraid, an empty slogan. It's not a practical matter. We have to do the things that we're capable of doing. And even if it sounds unambitious, I think that, again, with education, with constant efforts to spread the word, I think this is one practical matter, especially for those of us who have children. It's something that we could think about. So I think that unambitious as this may sound, I believe that we should not fall into this delusion of somehow expecting miracles. I know that years ago I made the analogy that some have made about the fall of the Soviet Union. That just a few years before 1989, hardly anyone predicted that this system would fall. And I kept predicting that, okay, we've got so many of the same seeds of contradiction and dissatisfaction that ours could crumble any moment. Well, I've been waiting for that crumbling for some time. And I think that these small, more practical, it's not glamorous. It's not at all glamorous. But these small steps, running for office locally, perhaps establishing communities, I believe these are things that we can do now. And we must do what we can do in order to save our civilization. Thank you very much.